This month, we'll reflect on the theme of abundance in our lives from a spiritual perspective. Each week, I'll come at it from another angle. Immigration is a moral issue this morning, transcendentalism next week, and I'll close my month's preaching on hunger. As a foundation for our thinking, though, this month, I want to begin today with a bit of theology by continuing last Sunday's discussion of universalism, and this will all make sense. A few summers ago, I spent 8 wonderful days leading a spiritual discussion group on a rocky shoal called Star Island. Has anyone been there? Oh good, a few of you, great. The Unitarian Universalist Retreat Center is an island with a little over a half-mile circumference that rests 10 miles, give or take, off the coast of New Hampshire and Maine. The week that I went to in particular was a working retreat for over 150 religious educators, ministers, RE teachers, and their families. Aside from strong rains on the ferry ride in and the closing night's thunder and lightning extravaganza, that was truly gorgeous. Nothing like being in a thunderstorm with no land in sight. We had mostly sunny days that occasionally flirted with fog, mist, and the rare, strong breeze. As one colleague put it, the land of water, sun, and spontaneous song in the air. Besides leading that discussion group and 2 worship services, I gave myself only one other assignment. I was to read Rita Nakashima-Brock and Rebecca Ann Parker's book, Saving Paradise: How Christianity Traded Love of This World for Crucifixion and Empire. I know, light reading, right? That's what I thought too. I thought in a week I could get through the 420 pages with the accompanying 132 pages of notes, acknowledgments, and index. So picture it, I'm sitting on a wooden rocking chair on a huge porch, big enough for dozens of these chairs, with sunscreen on my legs, sunglasses on my face, and a cup of coffee clean to my side. Some habits die hard, even on remote islands. With this book in my hands. I'm reading for a while all about how early paintings depicting the waters of life flowing down from all over the world. I'm hearing stories about how depictions of the crucifixion are nowhere in Christian art for at least the first 500 years. They paint picture after picture of little earthly paradises with people like you and me dwelling in them. The focus in early Christian art is entirely about living life, appreciating the paradise that's here, and stewarding the world we have. Occasionally, I look up from the book and remark at how pretty that lighthouse is in the way, where the sun is really glorious, hanging right there, or look at those 6 herons flying overhead. Then I go back to my academic reading about how many places they visited in Europe to see the paintings with their own eyes. Eventually, and it took me a lot longer than you'd imagine, I realized I need to stop reading about evidence for paradise and enjoy the paradise I'm presently sitting on a rocking chair in. That's one half of the heart of the message of universalism. There is nothing to attain, it's already here. The potential, there's nowhere to go to get it, it's already here. There's nothing to do to make it. The potential for paradise is the thin line between searching for it in a book and looking up from our pages to see the world around us. Nothing is gained, but our perceptions shift into focus as we see it. I did travel about 8 hours to get there, but what I really traveled for was the lesson. What I saw is here too. Doesn't require flights of herons banking in spirals over rocky shoals to exist, although Long Island certainly has its fair share of herons too. Same reality rests in the smiles we share with one another. The substance is identical, even if the form differs. What we do to craft the world more picturesquely in our architecture, our botanic gardens, simply serves to show the respect and care we have for creation, and reminds us to continue to share those smiles with one another. I do believe that perception is key. One of the reasons we travel so far for rest, particularly in areas like the one in which we live, is that it can be hard to see clearly amidst all the busyness, concrete and impersonality on the street, for those who might commute into the city, and for the rest of us, there's no shortage of busyness with our classworks, our school, our teams, our tests. We receive so many messages from the people signs and media around us telling us that the world is full of stress and pain and unconcern. Then we forget that it doesn't have to be this way, certainly not to this degree. We travel to get away, to forget one life and remember another, breaking the patterns, breaking the monotony, severing our commitments for a week or a month. We are free once more to see beyond our keyboards and phones and noses. Now, we might not be able to create paradise on our own, but we can mar it. We're more likely to bring harm into our world and our relationships when we act without grounding. Living an ethical life is based upon applying a set of values to everyday challenges, confusions, and concerns. It's based upon something. When we run into the difficult choice, we have a set of values that we can refer to in making sense of whatever current dilemma we face. I firmly believe this work is more successful when it's grounded in our theology, which is just a big word to say how we mean and make meaning in our lives. The book by Brock and Parker, Saving Paradise, points out that the depictions of paradise were all in this world that remind us that the mythical Garden of Eden is on earth and not in heaven. To get to this place, where we meaningfully act to preserve the paradise we dwell in, we need to live this theology on the ground, in our kitchens, behind our computer screens, remembering in every moment that the potential for finding paradise is in our lived experiences is the key to helping to heal and preserve our world and to live a moral life. If we live to learn out balanced relationships with kindness, uplifted by the knowledge of the glory of what is right before us, it becomes increasingly difficult to live in ways that cause harm to the gift that we have been given, that none of us have earned, life. I said earlier, all of this is one half of the message of universalism. That second half simply is that it applies to all of us. Early American universalists like Hosea Ballou, who we heard in our kids' story last week, or John Murray, argued in a time when widespread hellfire and damnation was the scope and content of preaching in the U.S., that instead God was a loving God and offered salvation to all. John Murray famously said, "Give them hope, not hell." To this day, union ministers, among most other clergy, are trained to find a message of hope in every sermon. This is not the norm always in American religious culture, even though I firmly believe it's always been the core of religious truth. Ballou and Murray's primary concern about this message was that an all-loving God could not condemn anyone to everlasting pain and suffering. 200 years later, we still hear this concern, although our words that express it may change. Our UU Standing on the Side of Love campaign that is working toward deeper collaborations for justice in the realms of sexuality, immigration, environmental and economic justice, take this message and apply it to the world we live in. If our roots tell us that none should suffer, that life and God are our loving core, then we need to build institutions that match this reality. Standing on the side of love means that we're seeking to reflect our theology, our heritage, and our values. It also reminds us of the universalist message that salvation is for all. It's not for some people who look a certain way or have more prosperity, or just those who live a straight life. If we put all this together, we have heaven is on earth now, heaven's for all people, give them hope, not hell, stand on the side of love. It's a progression from theological grounding to ethical application. How does this apply on the human side of the question of paradise, though? What does a paradise look like when it's inhabited by people? What challenges, I know, but it's inhabited, right? It's so easy when it's just a picture on the wall, that's really beautiful, that's great, but when we actually have to be there and we have to wait online at Starbucks in the morning, it looks a little more difficult. What challenges do we face when we seek to steward that type of paradise? And what does it mean when we don't necessarily, what does salvation mean when we don't necessarily believe in an afterlife? Today I'd like to look at how this applies to how we as a nation steward our relationships in a world of abundance, with the potential of compassionate immigration reform before our legislature right now. Reflecting on our moral base is timely and relevant. Let's build some context for this. Often, the media portrays this in simplistic terms. You're either for anything goes with immigration, right? Or you're against new people joining our country. The reality is far more complex. We have an immigration track that often takes people 5 to 10 years to navigate the system when they have family who are already citizens. It can be twice as long for others. For those on Facebook, if you follow my public RevWho page, I have posted a nifty little comic that maps out the timelines and fees associated with the paths to citizenship. I posted it this morning. Imagine the horror in your own family of having a close family member deported in your own household. You don't need to agree with all the politics of immigration reform right now, but we do have to nurture empathy for the human side of the crisis, or we'll never find a way through. This past General Assembly, our denomination passed a statement of conscience called Immigration is a Moral Issue. If you, we'll post it later on our website to read the entirety of it, but I'll read a very short bit of it right now. Today people leave their places of birth and migrate for the same reasons people always have: to be safe, to meet their needs for food and shelter, and to better their lives. Thus, violence, environmental change, and economic conditions often motivate migration. Acts of violence that drive people to migrate include armed conflicts, violence against women, violence related to sexual orientation and gender expression, and the list goes on. Much of these problems echo the call of paradise on earth, when we treat resources and people as commodities, when we live our lives from a place of scarcity rather than abundance. Strife and pain follows. There are also other sides of immigration reform that deal more with how people are treated rather than who gets to stay and who must go. A few summers back, I and 4,000 of my closest UU friends took part in a week-long series of protests in Arizona in response to what was the act that was happening then, SB 1070, which empowered local police to be immigration officials, along with other practices that seem to amount to racial profiling. The Supreme Court has since upheld one provision of the law and struck down the rest. I'm going to focus not on the law, which has been decided, but on the treatment of people detained. You know, just to real briefly, racial profiling. Imagine if you're driving on the road and you get pulled over for speeding, and you don't only have to show your driver's license, you need to show your paperwork. How many people carry paperwork with them that proves they're citizens? So it doesn't, and there's no fear for you, right? That's what we're talking about with these sorts of things, having to walk around with documentation. During the week of protests, we saw where people were held. There's a camp where we keep people in this country locked up in tents. Alleviated by fans, these prisoners remain in canvas directly under the beating sun. In the summer, this tent city suffers from 110-degree weather. Not far from the tent city in Arizona, animals are in air-conditioned shelter. At the evening vigil, we read the names of 122 detainees who have died in U.S. detention centers in that year alone, none of whom ever went to trial for a crime. In 1997, Amnesty International published a report on those jails, which found that the tent city is not an adequate or humane alternative to housing inmates in suitable jail facilities. Amnesty International is writing about us. Locking human beings in oppressive heat, whose only crime was seeking a better life for their children, is as far from standing with the least of these that I can imagine. It is a perversion to call this right or just or humane. Policies like that SB 1070 that grant local police forces the ability to pretend they are federal immigration agents, which is now upheld by the Supreme Court, or the Federal Secure Communities Program of max detention and deportation, harm the fabric of the American dream. They see the U.S. is not big enough to dream any longer. My great-grandparents came to the U.S. when there was no documentation necessary to make them legal. Does anyone else have that in their family? Great. And none of those folks had to have paperwork. If our policies then matched our policies now, likely none of us who had our hands up, including myself, would be here right now. Now we've shifted to a belief that our own economic failures are because of strangers. They're stealing our jobs. It's factually inaccurate, this statement. It's dismissive of their, quote, humanity, quote, their, not humanity. And it's also too easy to wash our hands of our own responsibilities in the financial welfare of our own nation. Economics aside, the U.S. cannot support the inhumane treatment of fellow people on our own soil. Even if your politics tell you that immigration reform means less immigrants. I urge you to take a hard look at the atrocities being committed in places like Arizona, or the way we viciously split families across our country. Maybe our government will decide to continue to maintain harsh restrictions on immigration. But if it does so, it must come up with ways to enforce those laws in a manner that is in accordance with our conscience and values. I believe that we are still big enough to dream. I believe we are still human enough to accept difference, to welcome the stranger, to introduce our children to the beauty of others. But even if you don't, or you don't see the issue in this light, these prison camps are not the American way. Sending a father away from a partner or a child is not our way. You can stand for restricting immigration and still oppose the brutal treatment of families. I could talk at length about discrimination in employment and payment practices, the injustices of globalization, the dueling myths that often get lifted up that the poor people don't work hard enough. That's why they're poor, that one we all hear. Or its flip side talking point, they're taking our jobs. We could inquire when does a particular group to legally immigrate and how this has changed over the past 500 years of colonization, invasion, war, and immigration on this soil. Who gets to call themselves citizens? And who gets to call themselves slaves? All of this has happened in our history. All are questions of identity, of power, of self-justification. They're little acts of building white picket fences, dividing up paradise on earth, thinking it somehow grants us more than we already have, or at the very least, staves off losing what little we do have. Instead, I'd like to reflect upon our theological basis again for this ethical dilemma. If we accept that paradise is here to be found in this life, on this earth, in the midst of human relationships, then we need to begin to craft social policy that seeks to generate harmony and not reimagine suffering in newer and more disastrous ways. If we reap what we sow, then planting a garden that instills fear among folks who may look different than those who are in power is a farming practice that will only harvest fear, separation, and dissonance. It's a gardening practice that assumes far too much about what and who it is to be an American. These laws and practices around immigration actively work to dissemble the religious message of heaven on earth. It divides the world into us and them, with us looking a certain way conveniently with some variance, and them always looking another way. Our universalist message says that the promise of life is one made to all people. Our global legal system may not be at a stage where we can imagine it without national identities, but our application of our laws should not serve to make people illegal. It should not generate fear on the streets. And believe me, when a migrant is not able to go to a police officer in an emergency because they double as an ICE agent, immigration, there is fear on the streets. Our laws should buffer up right relations. We cannot trade one for the other. Does what we're doing increase the peace or disturb the peace? Does it unnecessarily back people up against the border of our own creation? The responsive reading by Audre Lorde, we read this earlier this morning together, speaking of another type of border, was a curious one to choose. It seems to have the opposite message from our universalist clarion call of hope. I choose it intentionally for this reason. Lorde poignantly captured the effects of the worldly powers of racism, sexism, homophobia, and nationalism. For those of us who live at the shoreline, standing upon the constant edge of decision, crucial and alone. The truth of the matter is that the egalitarianism of paradise is yet to be seen on this earth. This is true because theologically, humans have tragically tended and attended to the message of separation and scarcity. We create this hell for ourselves on this earth. We choose our theologies carefully, lest they create the world we fear. I began the sermon describing a shoreline of beauty and privilege and respite. I ended with Lord's shoreline of decision. It is my religious prayer that we live out our lives in such a way that all people have access to the shoreline in which I spoke. I also pray that we as a people are able to see the ways in which we all sometimes place our fellow inheritors of the garden at the shoreline in Lord's poem. It is important to make space to honor what we learn from both types of shorelines, without saying one perspective makes the other untrue. Blithely holding on to the dream of paradise without recognizing the suffering that's part of our world leads to reckless idealism and inaction. Staring solely into the pain of the failings of human generosity leaves us dry and paralyzed. Arguing for one side or the other as dominant can be a satisfying intellectual exercise, but that path has no draw to it. It will never lift us up. The potential for paradise as our inspiration in our daily lives, and the tragedy of Lord's shoreline as a marker for what we lose when we give up that dream. One great challenge of the human experience is to hold both of these truths in tension. I find hope in her poetry for the very reason that she faces this truthfully. Universalism calls for this broader view.